Hello, my name is Chris Bayliss. I'm Director of Standards with ASI. I'm going to talk to you today about eligible scrap and the role of scrap in ASI's chain of custody standard and the requirements for eligible scrap. Today's agenda, we've got about 40 minutes now, I guess, just over 40 minutes. And I'll try and motor along. We're going to look at the entity and mass balance and what mass balance means within ASI's system. We'll look at recycled aluminium and its role in ASI chain of custody as differentiated from primary aluminium. We'll look at inputs, outputs, yield, and how internal scrap is treated within entities. Then eligibility and ineligibility of scrap sources. And then finally, due diligence, documentation, and reporting. This is a kind of a follow-up session, I guess, to one that we did in May of 2022, which looks broadly at ASI's approach to chain of custody, in particular, the mass balance approach, lots of lemons being used in that session and other things. So if you want a more broad look at ASI's chain of custody requirements, I recommend you go and have a look at that. 45 minutes on. Today we'll just be doing scrap. Let me get rid of the screen so that we can properly look at some materials. So today, the focus, as in that previous session, really it all starts with the entity, and I'll quickly run through the entity again. Entities within ASI's system can be scoped in many different ways. They can be single assets, single operations, they can be multiple operations, they can be integrated operations, they can be horizontally integrated, so multiple assets of the same type. And the way that ASI's chain of custody system works is that within the entity, within the certification scope of the entity, however that is defined, you can have mixing of chain of custody and non-chain of custody material. But at the boundaries of the entity, when material enters the entity or leaves the entity along the chain of custody from another chain of custody entity or to another chain of custody entity, that material has to be accompanied by documentation, so traceable with documentation, and that material must be 100% chain of custody material within a given shipment. So you can't have shipments that contain 50% ASI aluminium, for instance. It has to be 100% aluminium within a shipment. So what that means is it's a mass balance within the entity. There's allowed mixing, even if this is 100 sites all the way around the world, incorporating many different supply chain activities. You can have mixing. There's not physical traceability within, but there is physical traceability between entities, and that must be accompanied by documentation. Last time around, we looked at bauxite, alumina, aluminium. We touched on scrap, but didn't do it too much. So I'm going to look at that today. The primary route is very clear. You know, it goes bauxite, alumina, the smelter for electrolytic aluminium, and then into the cast house, the primary cast house. That's one route for chain of custody material to flow along the chain. The other is recycled aluminium. And recycled aluminium, I would say, enters the system in a supply chain activity called remelting refining. So it's the point at which aluminium scrap gets turned into aluminium. That can be chain of custody aluminium, or it can be non-chain of custody ASI aluminium or non-ASI aluminium. Talk a bit about that in a moment. So it's the remelter refiner process step, or what we call supply chain activity, that turns scrap into ASI aluminium. And it's from the ASI aluminium point onwards that you have a chain of custody. So it's the remelter refiner step that creates the chain of custody material, in the same way that bauxite mining is the process that creates ASI bauxite and begins the chain of custody from the primary aluminium flow. It's at the cast house, of course, that various things are mixed. So the refiner remelter has an input of scrap and an output of liquid aluminium, in the same way that the smelter, the electrolytic process, has an input of alumina and an output of liquid aluminium. And it's in the cast house that liquid aluminium is then turned into cast products. Now, of course, in the remelting in remelters, the remelter refiner step, that process, and the cast house or the furnaces attached to the cast house are often the same process, the same integrated process. And so we kind of use this liquid aluminium as a kind of a heuristic device. It doesn't really exist in the real world. You don't transport liquid aluminium from the remelter refiner to the cast house as you might do in a smelter. But we think of that phase transition as being the point at which those two processes are how those two processes are separated. And the reason for that is that the cast house also can have an input or a charge of cold metal. And so we need a way of not having the cold metal entering at the remelter refiner step where we're treating scrap. We need the scrap to be kind of treated differently. So that's how we kind of think about it. It's the cast house where the primary flow, the recycled flow, the cold metal flow come together. And even if that's in the same furnace, we think about remelting refining as a separate process step within ASI's chain of custody standard. In the same way that we treat all materials into the entity in the mass balance, it's essentially, the essential rule is that the output percentage of chain of custody material in whatever form must be equal to or less than the, I should do this the other way around, shouldn't I? Because you go left to right. The output should be less than or equal to the input percentage. So you can't create a chain of custody there. It has to just be passed along the chain of custody. So output percentage must be equal to or less than input percentage. The tricky bit comes because you have different yields. So that's why we ask for some data on intra-entity flows to allow us to see outputs of different types of material that change mass, which is an implication for scrap. I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. So what are the inputs and outputs to the system for scrap? Well, we talk about eligible scrap in ASI's chain of custody system. That's scrap that is eligible in the remelter refiner step to be turned into ASI aluminium, transformed into ASI aluminium. So eligibility of scrap determines the ASI aluminium production in liquid form from the remelter refiner, and ultimately that's an input to the cast house. Again, as I say, even if it's in the same furnace. So it's eligible scrap, which is this kind of precursor to ASI aluminium from the scrap stream. So eligible scrap in, liquid aluminium and thus other and downstream aluminium out. So it's a cast house that all comes together into cast products. But it's eligible scrap that comes in, and that eligibility is the signal for the system to treat that material as chain of custody compliant. If scrap comes into the system and does not conform to that eligible scrap status, it can't be turned into ASI aluminium, and it's treated as a non-COC material as it flows through. Exactly the same for all other materials. It can be mixed within the boundaries of the entity. So you can mix eligible scrap and non-eligible scrap, absolutely, in the remelter refiner phase, but you need to be tracking that downstream or to your outputs as well. And the non-eligible scrap will form part of your non-chain of custody material, your non-ASI aluminium. Last time around, I played around with a few lemons. This time around, I've got some potatoes. Scrap is a funky beast. It's not like aluminium in, aluminium out. Scrap can take lots of different forms. It can be clean scrap. It can be kind of dirty scrap. It can have differential yields. So what happens to scrap of different qualities as it comes into the system? How can I have a kind of an eligibility of scrap when the amount of aluminium I'm going to get out of that process, the remelting refining process, is necessarily going to be less than the input? Well, what we do is we say within your material accounting period, which could be up to 12 months, you would take account in the input of the yield or the losses from the treatment of that scrap. So while you may have eligible scrap that is in the multiple tons of scrap of different forms coming in, the bits of information you need to be considering is not just what the total tonnage is, or the share of that tonnage compared to your total scrap input, CO's eligible scrap and non-eligible scrap. You also need to be thinking about what the recoverable aluminium is from this, and using that as the metric for this ASI aluminium that is generated in the remelter refiner step. So it's not the volume of potatoes that's important, it is the volume of potatoes minus their peelings. You need to be knowing the total volume of material coming in, but using the volume of aluminium that is going to be generated from this process minus all of the stuff that you won't recover. So for instance, for post-consumer scrap, for highly contaminated scrap, you would need to be using an aluminium number that's tied to the yield of your refining, remelting processes. So that's scrap that comes into the system. The question we often get is, what about internal scrap? And you may have seen, I hope you've seen, in the last version of the Chain of Custody Standard version 2, or the last major revision, which was released in April 2022, we removed reference, or we removed criteria related to internal scrap. And the reason for that is this mass balance system that I spoke about at the beginning. Entities and their given certification scopes allow for mixing, essentially a black box within the entity. And remember, that's not just a single asset necessarily, that can be multiple assets. It can be multiple supply chain activities, multiple locations, etc. Internally, this is a black box. We don't see what happens in here. We don't need to see under a mass balance system. The important points within the entity are when material enters the entity and when material leaves the entity. And if it's chain of custody material, that it leaves and enters with appropriate documentation, as referenced under section 9 of the Chain of Custody Standard. So internal scrap, and by that I don't just mean internal scrap or runaround scrap within a given site or location or asset, but internal scrap within the entity. So even between locations, between processes, between continents, but within the same certification scope, that's not relevant for chain of custody. We don't need to see that information. That doesn't need to be visible. And so internal scrap is not seen by COC, and so we've removed that from the chain of custody standard. The important points are material entering the entity, scrap coming in, aluminium coming in, alumina coming in, and what leaves the entity, scrap going out, aluminium going out, alumina going out. So the internal scrap, you won't see it because COC itself doesn't see it. It's when material enters and leaves. And if it goes as with chain of custody documentation, we call that input and output from the process. So what is eligible? What is eligible to be transformed from scrap into ASI aluminium through the refining remelting step? Well, we categorize scrap in broadly in 3 ways. And one of those ways isn't even scrap. So let me start with that one. We say that aluminium that has been recovered from waste stream, so that is dross. The biggest one is probably dross. So waste streams from cast houses, for instance. The aluminium that is recovered from that dross processing, external to the entity, of course, because if it was internal, we wouldn't see it. Dross that's processed externally, that comes into the system as a type of eligible scrap. Now, I know it's not a scrap, but that's how our system sees it because it's a recycled source of material. And so the aluminium that is recovered from that material is an input to the remelter refiner process. And dross from whatever sources, or aluminium from dross, from whichever sources they are, chain of custody source, non-chain of custody source, is eligible scrap as long as the purchaser of that material, the entity that has input the material into their process, has done their due diligence on that supply of material. And it's in section 7 of the chain of custody standard that you can find the due diligence related criteria. So a shorthand for that is to say that all dross, all aluminium recovered from dross or other aluminium containing wastes is eligible, no matter where it's come from, no matter what its source, as long as due diligence has been done on the input material. So let's get that out of the way for now, the non-scrap bit of eligible scrap. 2 more, post-consumer scrap and pre-consumer scrap. And they're defined post-consumer as aluminium that has been generated from an end-of-life product, aluminium scrap that's been generated from an end-of-life product. So post-consumer scrap generated from an end-of-life product. And for post-consumer scrap, it's a similar situation as for dross, as I mentioned earlier on. That post-consumer scrap is freely available, freely eligible to enter this ASI chain of custody system and to become ASI Aluminium, as long as the entity which is bringing that material in has done its due diligence on the source of that material, be it traders or other sourcing. So post-consumer, as for aluminium recovered from dross, freely eligible as long as the entity has done their due diligence. Why is that? Well, similarly as for the dross, we want to encourage, and in fact, we want to drive increased quantities and indeed qualities of post-consumer scrap coming back. As much of that material coming back into the system as possible. So post-consumer scrap, no limit other than due diligence on that. Pre-consumer scrap, fabricator scrap, scrap which is generated during the production of aluminium products, all the way through from the cast house right the way through to final product manufacture. All of the scrap generation from those processes are pre-consumer scrap, except when those processes are within the entity's certification scope, then it's internal scrap. So if you have, for instance, in this entity, a theoretical cast house producing slab and a rolling mill, and the rolling mill generates scrap, and that scrap comes back into the system through the cast house. This internal scrap, we don't see it. So that is not pre-consumer scrap, that's freely circulating within the entity. So pre-consumer scrap is any material that's generated in the production of aluminium products all the way through from the cast house to final product, as long as it has crossed an entity threshold. So the edge of the certification scope, left another entity and entered another entity. And pre-consumer scrap is treated differently. So pre-consumer scrap under the chain of custody standard, it can only be eligible if it has been generated by a chain of custody certified entity. There's one caveat to that. I'll speak about that in a moment. Pre-consumer scrap can only be eligible if it has come from a chain of custody certified entity. So pre-consumer scrap that's generated by a can manufacturer that is not chain of custody certified, for instance, that scrap cannot come back into the system as eligible scrap and ultimately ASI Aluminium if that can manufacturer is not chain of custody certified. So even if chain of custody certified material is going to that can manufacturer, if they are not themselves chain of custody certified, the scrap is ineligible and can still enter the entity system, but it will be non-eligible scrap and thus non-ASI, non-COC material. There is a caveat, as I said, and that is where, and this was the introduction in the last version of the chain of custody standard, where it can be demonstrated that the generator of the scrap, non-COC, is returning scrap to the producer of the metal that can manufacturer consumed, so a rolling mill, for instance, and the rolling mill is COC certified. If it can be demonstrated that that's a closed loop, even though the can manufacturer is not COC certified, that is eligible. So if you can demonstrate that there is a closed loop, and thus also that the volumes are correct, then that is eligible. So that's an interesting introduction in the last version of the standard, is that closed loop systems for pre-consumer scrap, where you can demonstrate that it's flowed through only one non-COC certified entity and come back to the COC certified cast house, then that is eligible. What does that mean? How does that work? Well, as for all other materials, it means that scrap, that pre-consumer scrap, sorry, that is generated by a COC certified entity, that can only enter back into the system, into another COC certified entity, if it's accompanied by documentation. So it's the same rule as for bauxite, alumina, and aluminium. Pre-consumer scrap, eligible scrap, must be accompanied by chain of custody documentation when it flows from a COC certified entity to another COC certified entity. Without that documentation, the scrap is not eligible. Note here that, well, before we go on to that, let's do something else. That eligibility tied to the documentation, and don't forget from before when I said that shipments must be 100% chain of custody material, they can't be part chain of custody material. What that means is that in mixed scrap shipments, necessarily they are ineligible. So a mixed scrap bundle that contains pre-consumer scrap and post-consumer scrap, really, unless you can demonstrate that the pre-consumer, well, you can't. The pre-consumer scrap has to be 100% pre-consumer scrap from a COC certified entity. So any pre-consumer scrap must come with documentation in order for it to be eligible. And that documentation should apply to 100% of the scrap shipment input to the system. So that's something I kind of want to get out there today, is that post-consumer, yes, fill your boots, it's fully eligible. Pre-consumer must come with documentation, and it must apply to 100% of the scrap shipment as well. In terms of tonnages, what applies? I mean, this, let's say you have a can manufacturer with a yield of, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm going to say 80%. So they're consuming 100 tons of rolled material. They produce 80 tons of cans and 20 tons of scrap, just as an example. And let's say their input to that can manufacturer is 50% chain of custody certified. So what that means is ultimately 40 tons of their output of cans, 50% of the total 80, is ASI Aluminium, is chain of custody certified. But what that also means is that the scrap that's generated has the same percentage tied to it. So the 20 tons of scrap generated by that COC certified entity, only 50% of that scrap is eligible. So that needs to be recorded in the material accounting system, is ultimately the data that is sent to us every year under 1.7 for those of you who report 1.7 data. That's why you'll see that we've started to ask for output of total scrap as well as output of eligible scrap from COC certified entities. We need to keep an eye on, we need to understand that the share of scrap that's leaving COC certified entities is related to the input of material. It's not the case that 100% of the scrap from a chain of custody certified entity is eligible scrap. It's not. It's related to the input percentage. So we need to keep a track of what is eligible coming back into the system as well as non-eligible. I'm having a look here to see if there are any questions. I can't see any open questions, but feel free to use the question box to ask any of your questions. I think we're going to have some time at the end, hopefully, to do that on what I've talked about today or on any other issues that are of interest. So documentation, that's explained within the chain of custody standard. Section 9 about the kind of information that needs to be recorded with the eligible scrap. And I'll be honest with you, the reason why we're having this call today, the reason why this has piqued our interest in the Secretariat is that in the data that we collect every year, the 1.7 data, we are seeing an increase in recycled material coming back as chain of custody material. It's dominated by post-consumer. So today, I think there's about 12 million tons of ASI aluminium produced, chain of custody certified aluminium produced in the world today at the cast house, 12 million tons. And of that, around 500,000 tons is coming from post-consumer scrap. I would say predominantly can scrap, used beverage cans. And around 100,000 tons of pre-consumer scrap. So post-consumer scrap does dominate, but pre-consumer scrap is growing. But what we've seen in the data that we've been collecting is that we're having a larger number of inputs than outputs for scrap, actually, in general. And what that's telling us is that there's not necessarily appropriate recording of outputs of eligible scrap. So this is why we want today to say to you, you need to be documenting, it needs to be documented pre-consumer scrap that comes out of the system. And we need you to be reporting both the COC material, but also the non-eligible scrap that you generate as well, so that we can begin to identify where there are any issues in the chain. So documentation of the scrap is important when it's a pre-consumer source. Post-consumer source, aluminium recovered from wastes, including drosses, no documentation required, but due diligence is required. And as I say, section 7 of the chain of custody standard is the place to go to find out about those due diligence processes that are required. Pre-consumer scrap must be 100% shipment, must be documented, and must come from a COC certified entity unless it's in a closed loop that's clearly identifiable as a closed loop. I'm going to open the floor to any questions, if anyone has any. I haven't seen any. Otherwise, I might go to the GHG question that I did get in advance. So the question was, how do we allocate greenhouse gases to scrap? And this is a discussion that's ongoing in lots of different fora at the moment, including our climate change working group, which is working on a method for 1.5 degree pathways for entities, which is under criterion 5.3 of the performance standard. And really, there are two approaches to allocation of emissions to scrap. You can say that, for pre-consumer scrap that is, you can say that the environmental burden that is that occurs during the production of a product, you can either assign that 100% to the product, or you can share that burden between the product and the scrap that is generated during its production. So I draw your attention back to what I was saying before about our treatment of eligibility for pre-consumer scrap, where we say that the share of input material has to be the share that's used for both your product and for the scrap. So the way that we work in COC is that we treat scrap, pre-consumer scrap, a bit the same as the product. It requires some kind of traceability or documentation. It has a burden or COC-ness that is equivalent to the product itself. But in life cycle analyses, both approaches are appropriate. You can either assign 0 emissions to your scrap and put them all into your product. It means your product's got a higher footprint. Or you can share the emissions between the product and the waste stream. And there's big discussions at the moment about which is the right method to follow. And I'm going to say now they both are. The issue is when you have two different methods being applied within the same value chain, where you get an opportunity potentially for the loss of emissions or undercounting of emissions through the value chain. So really the important thing is to ensure that there is a common method being used along. And this is where in the climate change working group, we're going to be having these discussions. This is where the chain of custody could be quite useful, because the chain of custody is a mechanism to gain assurance along a given value chain. And documentation does flow between entities along that chain of custody. So there is the opportunity for us to, if not ensure, then at least reduce the risk of different methods being used along a value chain. And that's the route that we're exploring within the chain of custody, within the climate change working group, is can these two methods coexist within the sector as a whole, but have to be applied equally along a given supply chain. So watch this space. The plan is to have at least a first method available by Q4 this year. So yeah, watch this space. But maybe my big message is both allocation methods are appropriate under life cycle rules, but the application of those needs to take care with that in order that you don't lose any emissions from the whole. The video will be available for review later. Yes, it's always posted on our website. Thank you for the question, anonymous attendee. I know I talk very quickly. I also know this is a very complex space. So usually I recommend people watch my videos on double speed, but actually today, if you can watch it on half speed, that might be better as well. I think my key messages today are that eligible scrap has three potential sources. It's aluminium recovered from wastes, post-consumer scrap, and pre-consumer scrap. And the waste route and the post-consumer route are freely available for eligibility as long as due diligence is undertaken on the sourcing. But pre-consumer scrap is more complex, but ultimately comes down to the fact that any pre-consumer input to your entity, to the refiner, remelter, supply chain activity, must be accompanied by chain of custody documentation. If it does not, it is not eligible scrap. And that documentation must apply to 100% of the input shipment. That's the chain of custody as it stands today. Of course, we will see an evolution, I think, of the chain of custody in the future to meet different market expectations. And also, I would think maybe a change to, or at least a more, an expansion maybe of these eligible scrap types to take account of increasing closed loops, even at end of life. So that's an interesting place to for us to explore in the future. But for now, mass balance within, documentation between, and that applies to pre-consumer scrap, eligible scrap, as well as ASI bauxite, alumina, and aluminium. Is there another question coming? Question is, so the supplier of the scrap must be chain of custody certified, i.e. a member of ASI? Yes, the supplier of the pre-consumer scrap must be chain of custody certified. Thus, it must be a member. It needs to have performance standard certification and chain of custody standards certification as well. But that certification, I have to say, isn't enough. They need to have in their material accounting system enough chain of custody material flowing through the system to produce eligible scrap. If my theoretical can manufacturer isn't able to access chain of custody material, ASI aluminium, so it has zero input, its scrap is ineligible on the output side as well because it only has an availability of 0. So yes, they need to be a member, performance standard certified, chain of custody standard certified, and enough input to material to have produced eligible scrap. The only caveat, as I mentioned before, is when there's a closed loop, when the generator of that scrap may not be chain of custody certified, but the entity must demonstrate, the supplying entity must demonstrate that the material has come back in a closed loop. Yep, absolutely, Cindy, you understand absolutely correctly. You said it better than I have, so I'm going to read out your message. Pre-consumer scrap is eligible if it comes with papers, documentation, that prove that the pre-consumer scrap is from an ASI Chain of Custody certified company, or if we prove the closed loop system with our customer. That is correct. I would add to that, as I said before, it's not just that they are Chain of Custody certified company, it's that they've had enough input of ASI Aluminium, Chain of Custody material, to be able to output eligible scrap to the same percentage. Thank you. With that, I think this was a 45 minutes on. I think it's become a 37 minutes on. It's always nice. So my final thing to do is to say that we know it's complex, but we are here to help. So if you have any questions about eligible scrap or about any of the Chain of Custody standard, please do get in touch with us at the Secretariat, and we're happy to answer your questions. I think especially around things like yield, about the percentages involved. So if you have any questions about that, we're happy to help there too. But any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. My name's Chris Bayliss, Director of Standards at ASI. You can find my contact details on the website. And for those who are interested in COC more broadly, I encourage you again to go and look at that last video, which explains the whole of the system in more detail. Maybe one final thing to say is that we're now in 2023. We're about to enter, well, not about to, but soon 2024 will be here, and it's 2027 that is the proposed date for the revision to the Chain of Custody standard and the performance standard. And so a 3-year revision period starting next year is likely. And so if you want to keep abreast of changes to the Chain of Custody standard, or you want input to how that Chain of Custody standard evolves in order to meet your needs and the needs of the market, then do get involved with our working groups and get in touch with us as well about your needs too. One final question has come in. What is the CO2 footprint of pre-consumer and post-consumer scrap? It can be anything from 0 to 20, right? Post-consumer scrap generally recognized to have a allocation of 0 emissions. So the post-consumer scrap you treat as 0. Pre-consumer scrap, that's the big question. Do you allocate 0 or do you allocate the same as the product? And I would say today, both of those approaches are valid. Oh, do you know what? All the questions come in the last bit, right? Get your questions in early. Thank you. Question, how about scrap from traders? Treated exactly the same as all other materials in the system. Traders are not able to be Chain of Custody certified, but they do play a role. They would have to link up the purchaser of material, Chain of Custody material, with the seller of material. So it's exactly the same as for scrap. They need to link up the seller of the pre-consumer scrap, who's Chain of Custody, to the purchaser of scrap, who is Chain of Custody as well. But remember what I said before, no mixed batches, has to come with documentation, has to come with the COC certified entity. Great. With that, thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you for your questions. Feel free to get in touch with us at the Secretariat. Thanks, folks.